Dan, it is great to see you. So let's dive right into this, Dan. So a historic geopolitical moment here. Israel-Iran, that war going red hot. One question front and center, Dan, is just how long we think this conflict could last. When clients ask you, what are you telling them, Dan, and what are the variables that depends on?
Thanks, Josh. Good to see you. So it's an excellent question. How long does the war last and what does it depend on? I think it will take anywhere from a few days, assuming a war's end is negotiated soon, and I'm skeptical, to a few months. Hard to see this dragging on longer. It's hard both for Israel and Iran to sustain. But then again, war duration can always surprise. I mean, look at Russia-Ukraine. It was not expected to last 3+ years either, although it is a very different kind of war. So it's hard to say how long this will go, but for the first thing to say, it's unlikely that Iran wins it. It's not impossible, but very unlikely. And military events to date obviously tend to support that. In terms of victory, or at least ceasefire conditions, I mean, from Israel's perspective, it has to destroy or severely degrade Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. And that would be kind of what I would call a small victory. And regime change in Tehran, which again, it's a shifting goal, would be sort of more like a tentative major victory. Again, I think the first one is more likely. A small victory, a major one, not so much, and I'll explain one in a bit. But and from Iran's perspective, if you look, it wants to survive the war with its leadership and continue to develop its nuclear deterrent and missiles. Now, how does the conflict end? I think there are four ways. The first one is when Israel has judged that it has degraded Iran's nuclear program enough, its military leadership, its missiles programs. It could take weeks to months. The second way is through a resumption of talks. Again, the U.S. may prefer this, not today, but in the next few days. It seems unlikely, again, in the short term. The third one would be if the conflict actually expands, and if Iran, for instance, were to attack others in the region or do something that brings the U.S. into the fight, that would mean a much shorter and worse outcome for Iran. And the fourth scenario would be, which is far less likely, would be Iran carries a nuclear test or manages to quickly get nuclear weapons, and then there is nuclear deterrence established, which leads to a truce. Unlikely, but not impossible. I would say bet on the first kind of 1 to 3 scenarios, which are not favorable to Iran.
Do you believe, Dan, that the U.S. could get offensively involved here? Do you believe we could see American B-2 bombers over Iran?
It appears the U.S. prefer not to take offensive operations against Iran, though it is providing, again, of course, anti-missile defense to Israel. The Trump administration wants negotiations. It has taken a non-interventionist approach, at least to offensive operations. At the same time, it's not going to tolerate a number of potential Iranian actions. So if Iran were to do the following, which haven't happened, that would bring the U.S. in the conflict. And those would be, I would say, roughly 3. First, if Iran appears poised to cross the nuclear threshold. Second, if Iran attacks oil shipping in the Straits of Hormuz or the GCC states. And the third would be, of course, if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. assets in the region, resulting in major damage and or casualties. I mean, these kind of actions would bring the U.S. in offensive operations. For now, that's not, I'd say for now, that unlike those things, unless those things happen, I think that's unlikely.
I know you touched on this, Dan, but I just want to double click on it. Do you believe the regime in Tehran survives this conflict? 12 months from now, Dan, you're back on the show and we're talking about this. Do you think that regime is still in power?
Excellent question. Again, I think regime change, first of all, is almost impossible to predict. I'd say while the war is going on, and again, I don't think it's going to go on for a year, the chances of regime change are quite low. Once that ends, and if Iran loses the war, those chances are going to be materially higher. If you look at a regime change, again, it's unpredictable. The regime is domestically unpopular. It depends on repression to stay in power, but right now it is politically and militarily mobilized, and it's very hard to see how any kind of domestic opponents will go against the regime in a country that is under attack. Not only would that smack even many Iranians, even those that don't love the regime, as traitorous, but a war-mobilized regime would have less compulsion, frankly, killing its opponents. Yes, there is a question of whether the military could break now during the war and challenge the regime. My understanding is that's quite hard in Iran. The military is generally supportive of the government. In any case, the only regime challenge during a conflict would come from deep within the regime, basically elite or military fracture, which are hard or basically impossible to forecast. And again, we don't see any signs of it. After the war, if Iran loses the conflict, the government would basically be delegitimized. Iran would be in a very weak position, and the regime change would be quite possible, even likely. But again, for that to happen, Iran would have to lose the war and face a major loss of face and legitimacy domestically. And there are a ton of historical examples of aggressive regimes that fall within, I would say, 1 to 3 years after getting militarily defeated hard. You can think of the Argentine junta after the Falklands, or the Slobodan Milosevic regime in Serbia after getting bombed in Kosovo. Again, not guaranteed, but again, regime dynamics change would be on if Iran loses the war decisively.
Let's talk about market implications of all this, Dan, because it was a risk-on day in the markets. There's green everywhere today. I'm just curious what you make of that reaction and response from investors.
I would not honestly read a lot into a day or two of war-related news. Markets are, of course, pricing in the potential for a ceasefire. By the way, Israel says it doesn't want a ceasefire, I think, in the last hour, at least not just yet. Markets are pricing the positive news and the talks. Markets are also buying the thesis, which I think is right, that Iran loses within a month or two, give or take. And the broad view here obviously is bullish, and it's kind of buy the dip. So there hasn't been a dip. Interestingly, even Israeli equities in the countries under attack were rallying yesterday, which seems to be, again, making this consensus. Longer term, I think this is right, but there is a caveat here. The war can be unpredictable, and some assets may have more room to fall. The current buy the dip market assumes the war may be over very quickly. Again, this is possible, but I don't think markets are properly discounting the risk that the war goes on and keeps going.
What about the price of oil, Dan? Another risk here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the key here seems to be the Strait of Hormuz, which is still flowing right now. I'm curious what you see ahead. Do you think we see disruption there?
It's a really good question. Of course, if there is a ceasefire, to go to the first option, resumption in U.S.-Iranian nuclear talks, oil prices should drop, and to pre-April 11th levels. So the geopolitical risk premium would wash out. But if the war continues, again, prices may go up again because Israel may threaten to take out Iran's Persian Gulf oil capabilities, such as Karg Island, which would take a significant amount of oil off market, probably, a $10, $20 spike in the price is possible. Of course, if Iran were to close the Straits of Hormuz to shipping, a risk long highlighted, although increasingly unlikely, oil prices could double. Again, why I think it's unlikely is because the U.S. at that point would probably intervene to open the straits. That's bad militarily for Iran, of course. So it's an incentive for them not to do that.
Last question, Dan. I'm curious what kind of line of sight we have here. We know what Israel's objectives are here: destroy or severely degrade Iran's nuclear facilities. Does Israel have the military capabilities, Dan, to achieve those objectives?
It's an open question. I'd say that the answer is somewhat uncertain. So far, Israel has damaged some of Iran's facilities. This weekend, the assessment was about 20%, but this is still ongoing. It's an uncertain outcome. At the minimum, Israel needs to severely degrade Iran's nuclear program to stop. This is hard to do. Iran seems to lack capacity to bomb deeply dug facilities, such as the nuclear facilities at Fordow. So again, to the extent they can do that quickly, and there is not a ceasefire, this would prolong and complicate the war. And there is a case that, has Israel miscalculated the conflict and in fact went to war without the full capabilities to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, perhaps thinking the U.S. will join in the conflict. And as I said, the U.S. may not intervene. This is not a given. So the conflict could last longer and could become more uncertain, especially if Iran manages to sort of rebound and show staying power in the conflict. Again, I wouldn't bet on that, but it is something to watch.
Dan, always great to see you and to have you on the show. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.